Hey, world history, good to see you guys again. Moving forward in our book, chapter 13. Wow. Don't have a lot of time left for the year, and we'll definitely get through chapter 13. My goal is at least to get through chapter 14. And talking about, France and when they became extremely powerful monarchy, took over France and some other things. We'll hopefully get there, but for now we're going to focus on exploration and discovery, when Europe started trying to explore the rest of the world. There's a whole bunch of objectives here, but I'm just going to summarize it. You'll see them at the top as we go. The main thing I want you guys to get, and this is the task of the historian really, is I think people oftentimes, as I've told you before, think, oh, history is just about, memorizing this date or this battle or this person. That's so far from true, and that's boring, and nobody has the memory to remember everything like that. The goal of history is to understand how and why things went the way they did. Like when you're studying, how this age of exploration started, the key role of the historian is to understand the causes that led to this effect. What were the things that Europeans were thinking, or what were the conditions around them that caused them to do what they did? And so that's what we're going to try to do with this, is trace why the Europeans decided to begin exploring and looking for other routes to India and to China and stuff. So, and make sure you read chapter 13. I recommend by May 6th. It'll help you a ton when we take our next test, but just get that read now so that you'll be equipped and ready for next week's lessons too. Okay, so to summarize the beginning part, and we've been talking about this ever since the Crusades, Europe had been developing an obsession with goods from China and India and these Eastern nations, right? We talked about, I don't know if you guys remember, we were talking about how Europe used to be manors. You had the really rich who owned land, usually by birth and inheritance, and then you had serfs, peasants who basically worked on the land. And that was pretty much it. But with the Crusades and with this influx of new goods from Eastern countries, people were able to start selling. They were able to become merchants and eventually craftsmen, and people were able to start buying their way out of poverty, and you had a full-on middle class developing, right? You had the lords at the top who were nobles by birth, and then you had peasants who didn't have anything, but now you have this other option where if you could acquire goods to sell in the marketplace or at the fair, then you could gain enough money to begin to become your own person, basically. So remember, it's a huge part of European culture right now, is trying to get more stuff from the East so that they can get more money. Marco Polo was a European who lived in China for several years, and he wrote about the stuff he saw there. And when he published that book, that got around and everybody got really excited about, hey, if we could get over to China, we can see the same stuff that Marco saw and maybe make more money. And if you've ever played, by the way, that annoying game in the pool, oh my gosh, I cannot stand Marco Polo. That game, I just hate it. I've never liked it. And I feel like trying to swim with your eyes closed is never a good thing. That's just me. Anyways, another thing, like I just said, the Crusades, when Europeans were marching down to the Holy Land to fight the Muslims, they were encountering different cultures and goods from those cultures along the way, and they were bringing them back and making money. So because of Marco Polo's ideas, the Crusades and other things, Europe had been exposed to the goods that the East had to offer, and they wanted more. They wanted to keep getting those goods to keep making more money. But there were several problems that developed. Number one, as we talked about before, Italy was the star player in trade, and they had a monopoly on everything. Genoa, which is up in the northern part of Italy, they had control over the land, of course, the northern part of Italy, but also the land north of there too. And so they controlled and regulated a lot of the trade because they sort of had to go and deal with them along the way, and they were demanding money. And of course, Venice and southern Italy, they were controlling the Mediterranean trade routes. So you have Italy having this massive control, and they're making tons of money. And European nations north, whether it be England or Spain, Portugal, the Germanic states, they didn't want Italy sucking all their money away. So they were going to try to figure out how can we get around them to just buy, if we can bypass that monopoly, then we can make more money. It'd be easier. And on top of that, the Silk Road, which I should have probably put this on a map, but the Silk Road was a particular route that people would take all the way to China, crossing through several nations on the way. And Muslims had gained a lot of control. In 1453, they overthrew Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. So you're talking about Turkey, right? Muslims are going to change the whole landscape. If you've ever wondered before, by the way, if you read an ancient book, Turkey's called Anatolia. But the name changed to Turkey, and have you ever thought about why it's called Turkey? The answer is Turks. the Ottoman Turks, hence Turkey. That's why you see a lot of like Turkmenistan, like you see all these Turk prefixes, names in those nations in Turkey and up north, is because you had such a strong, powerful Muslim wave of influence. So anyways, they took control of Constantinople in 1453, which you could even argue really marks the end of the Roman Empire, not 476. But as these Muslims began controlling this land, that made it dangerous for Europeans to travel to China and India, because they were going to have to deal with Muslim opposition all the way. So now you have Italy controlling a lot of the trade and charging a lot of money, and now you have Muslim threats. So that really encouraged other European nations to try to find a new way to India. So I hope that's making sense. That's the key reason right there. And by the way, this is definitely test stuff right here. So if you're taking notes, I'd highly recommend tracking that. We're looking for the reasons why exploration happened in the first place, and that's the most important reason. But there's a few other smaller reasons too, and this kind of goes without saying, but why do people do anything? Well, they want to make money. And gold was, of course, the big thing that everybody wanted. They said, hey, maybe there's all these stockpiles of gold around the world we can find. Of course, some were bored, wanted adventure. Why not? Some people are just built to do that. And glory. If you go discover some massive island and come back and tell people about it, then you're going to get glory. You're going to be famous for doing that. So, of course, these are some obvious reasons people wanted to explore. There's also stories about this interesting fellow. I've always found this hilarious, but a guy named Prester John, who was this supposed African king. He was a Christian, and he was trying to fight Muslims, and he needed help in doing that. So Europeans wanted to rush to this fellow Christian. And this is just a guess on my part, but supposedly this Prester John fellow was loaded, like very rich. So it wouldn't make sense to me or it would make sense to me that maybe they were going to try to help him, but with a little bit of a fee attached to that. Maybe get some of that money from the guy. I don't know. But that's another reason people wanted to go explore and try to find this Prester John. They never found him, and by the way, most historians think that guy never existed. He's probably just a legendary figure. You also have more competition between the European nations. They're wanting to outdo each other. If anybody here likes anime, and if you've seen Dragon Ball Z, this is like the ultimate rivalry, Goku and Vegeta. So I grew up on Dragon Ball Z. Some of you are scratching your heads in confusion. Others of you understand what I'm saying. Either way, the point is that you had nations in Europe that were trying to outdo each other with money. That growing nationalism, pride in your nation states that you lived in. And they were trying to get richer than the other ones. So that's a little bit of the reasons why these European nations wanted to explore, but primarily, again, was trying to bypass the Italian monopoly and the threats of Muslims. So what about there's some other reasons too that allowed them to be able to follow their curiosity, and that was the tools of exploration. People had begun to uncover literature from the ancient world. When I say literature, I should say maps in particular, had begun to find some really good maps, and people got really excited about trying to improve cartography and learning how to make better maps. And they had to start with these ancient maps. And on top of that, people began developing some complex instruments, such as the astrolabe, which I don't have a picture on right now, but basically with all these different tools, and of course the compass was invented during this time, people were able to somewhat navigate themselves on these vast oceans. And if you remember back from geography, we talked about latitude and longitude. Latitude became pretty easy to determine with the astrolabe. Longitude, not so much. It's going to take a little while to develop precision with longitudinal direction, but latitude they could figure out during this time, and that allowed for some safer and more effective seafaring. Another thing, and this is a very important thing to understand, especially for long distance traveling, is for the longest time, people just used really big ships with tons of people rowing the ship. The problem with that is that you need a lot of storage space if you're going to have enough food. By the way, you hear these songs like 99 bottles of beer on the wall, blah, 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 like these pirate songs. Well, there's a lot of truth to that. They brought tons of beer because beer doesn't spoil. So, like, water can go bad pretty easily, So they would have to have barrels and barrels of beer and food, and of course there was scurvy, and they weren't quite sure about what to do with that yet. So big ships had their problems, but of course if you're going to have a smaller ship that's a little bit, and of course big ships also are not very maneuverable, there's problems there too. Small ships don't have the power for long distance travel. You're going to run out of space, and you need a lot of power to be able to handle, thousands of miles of travel. So what they did was they came up with a medium-sized ship called the caravel, and it was the best of both worlds. It was small enough that it was swift and maneuverable, so it wasn't slow and bogged down like a big ship, but it was big enough that it could have enough storage space and enough power to make those voyages. So the Spanish caravel was an extremely important invention that allowed people to travel during this time. If we were in the classroom, I'd show you this video, and it's actually pretty cool because it shows what a caravel looks like in action, but we're going to skip that for now. Okay, so that's a little bit about why the European nations feel the need to find alternate routes and explorers, because they're trying to, again, get away from that Italian monopoly and the threats of Muslims. But you also have the quest for gold and glory and all that stuff too. And then they had new advancements in shipping. I shouldn't say shipping, but I should say maritime advancements, you know, for the caravel and ways to map themselves on the globe. So with the means in place and with the desire and the needs, what happens next is what we're going to look at now. Now, Portugal's not that big of a country, you know, here you have Portugal right here. And why is it that they played such a prominent role? They were pretty wise in how they did things. Prince Henry the Navigator took a pretty early lead in saying, you know, we're going to get this exploration going, so let's go, you guys. And Prince Henry the Navigator is kind of credited with getting the ball rolling, you know, setting up everything from cartography to the right investments and working with the royalty to get explorations going. An interesting fact is one of the first things they did was they took over the Canary Islands right here. You can see, we talked about that on CNN 10 day one, I forget when it was, but we talked about the Canary Islands. But the Canary Islands were taken over by Portugal, and it's very messy. You have Spain, the Kingdom of Castile, I should say, at the time, and other nations fighting, the Dutch even fighting over it. But for all intents and purposes, Portugal gained a foothold and planted a base there for their explorations. They started growing sugarcane and wine, but mainly sugarcane. And this is an important fact. It's, again, one of the darkest marks on Western history, is they began to realize that sugarcane is profitable, but we need people to grow it for us. So they started capturing Africans and using them as slaves. And many have said this is where the African slave trade really began, was when Portugal captured the Canary Islands, because they were forced to grow sugarcane. And I don't know if I've told you guys this before, but whenever people think about the African slave trade, they automatically go to America, and especially to the American South. But that was the vast minority. I've read estimates that only about 6% of African slaves were in America. The vast majority you had on some islands here, but really go down to the Caribbean. That's where you had most African slaves brought over, is because they were trying to grow vast amounts of sugarcane to make rum and other things like that. So anyways, but that whole slave trade, we could really trace it back to the Canary Islands. So it's kind of an interesting fact. And on top of that, Portugal would eventually control the west coast of Africa here. They wanted to have, obviously, be close to the islands and to Portugal itself, but they were trying to establish bases away from Portugal. And that's one of the most brilliant things I would say that Portugal did, is if you study, our book doesn't go into it, so I don't want to get too caught up in it, but if you look at the Indian Ocean, they established really strategic bases all around the Indian Ocean and up here, obviously, in the Atlantic, because they wanted to have a network of ways to have information and places for their ships to go and restock. And they had a pretty smart thing going there. Not as much taking over large portions of land with force, but rather just having strategic points for an economic empire, which is much different than Spain, as we'll see. Some names you need to know. Bartolomeu Dias was the first to round the Cape of Good Hope. And basically you go all the way down to the southern tip of Africa. People didn't know how long Africa went. It's a very big continent. And so they would sail and sail and they'd give up and they'd turn around. But finally Bartolomeu Dias was the first guy, the first European credited with going all the way to the very bottom and seeing the end of it. But, you know, he didn't want to keep going because he didn't know how long it would keep going, so he turned around. But he rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the very tip of Africa. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama would be the first to keep going and get to India. So they successfully found an alternative route to India, bypassing the Italian monopoly and bypassing that crazy Muslim takeover. And so this is, again, this is key what I say here, the Portuguese broke the Muslim and you could say the Italian monopolies in the land routes that they controlled. How about Spain? So Spain is an interesting country in this too. Let me go back up to this map real quick here. You had Ferdinand and Isabel married and they created the nation of Spain, right? And that had just happened not too long ago. And so Christopher Columbus was an Italian who went to Spain to get basically funding to do his own adventure. And he had this idea that if he kept sailing west of the Atlantic Ocean, that he'd just hit India. He didn't know about the New World. Nobody did. They didn't know about these continents there. They thought that it was a much smaller world. So why bother going around Africa? If I just head west, I can just go all the way around the world and hit India that way. Easy. So eventually he convinced them, and they didn't have a lot of faith in him. You know, they gave him 3 ships and 90 men. It's funny because when he came back with success, they gave him like 17 ships and almost 2,000 men for the second voyage. But for this first voyage, they didn't really know what was going to happen, but they gave him some ships. You've all heard the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. And you know that in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So this is 1492, late 15th century, that Columbus is out on his adventure. He lands in San Salvador, which means Holy Savior, and that's when he discovered the Americas. And why do we call the natives to this day, why do we say Indians? That's not accurate. He's not in India, right? Well, Christopher Columbus thought he was in India, so he thought they were Indian people. So that's the name that kind of stuck. Even though it's totally not accurate, that's where the origin is when he thought he was in India. It would be Amerigo Vespucci that realized, by the way, that he landed in a new world, and America is named after the Italian Amerigo Vespucci, the guy who understood for the first time that Columbus had actually discovered a brand new world and 2 new continents. So with Spain and Portugal doing this exploration, they eventually start discovering, after Columbus finds basically the islands in the Caribbean, Spain and Portugal start heading over and exploring South America and other parts, and some fighting, of course, breaks out. So this is an important thing here. The Pope in 1493, again, this is a year after Columbus sailed, said, we're going to put together this line called the line of demarcation, and it's going to determine where Spain is allowed to explore and where Portugal is allowed to explore. Spain was given west of the line, and then, by the way, that's the dotted line here. We're going to talk about what happens in a bit, but look at this dotted line. Spain is given west of the line, Portugal is given east of the line. And even though it might seem like a jip from our modern eyes, they didn't have any clue what all this was at the time. They were still figuring it out, so they thought it was fair. So anyways, more fighting emerged because Portugal had already begun settling the tip here of, you see here, the eastern tip of South America. So the Treaty of Tordesillas modified the line and pushed it back a little bit. So you can see that Portugal gained control of what's modern day Brazil, and Spain had control of the rest of the continent. That's why, and I think we talked about this in geography last year, but that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese, and that's why the rest of South America speaks Spanish. It's because of this Treaty of Tordesillas / line of demarcation that gave Brazil to Portugal and gave the rest to Spain. That's why Spanish and Portuguese are the 2 languages, but that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese. So another guy worth talking about is Ferdinand Magellan. And he was a Portuguese guy who sailed for Spain, which gained him a lot of resentment from the Portuguese because they thought he was, again, that's that national pride. Portugal wanted Portugal to do well. Spain wanted Spain to do well. So when you have a Portuguese guy defecting and going to help Spain, he's going to gain a lot of hatred from his own people, which is what happened. In any case, Ferdinand Magellan was the first person credited with circumnavigating the Earth, meaning sailing around the entire Earth. Now, to be fair, he actually died on the way. Near the end, he was in the Philippines, and they converted a lot of him to Christianity, but then he got a violent skirmish happened, and he got stabbed with a spear and did not survive his own trip. But his crew made it back, and because it was his crew, he was given credit ultimately. This is a funny little video on Magellan, but I'm just going to skip that for now. And this is hilarious. I wish I could show you guys, but I'm just going to save the time. But Alex Jones, one of his freak out moments, when he mentions Magellan. Maybe I'll show you next year. Just remind me. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about, then we'll call today, is we're going to talk about when the Spanish and the Portuguese started coming over to the Americas, what they found. And they found some distinct groups of people. We're going to talk about 3 real quick. And again, this isn't, I wish we had more time to go deep into all these very respectable groups of people, but we just don't have the time. But the Mayans flourished from the 4th to the 10th centuries on the Yucatan Peninsula, I guess you could say. And southern Mexico, if you look, it juts out into a peninsula, and then you have the Gulf of Mexico above it. Well, that peninsula is where the Mayans lived. And so they were basically a bunch of city-states. They weren't one unified country like called Maya or something. They were like different cities that were nearby that knew each other, and they knew how to speak the same language, but were pretty independent in what they did. And so the Mayans were discovered during this time by the Europeans. You guys know the crazy architecture the Mayans have developed. Their calendar system is brilliant. I mean, there are so many things we can and should talk about the Mayans, but I have to keep us moving forward for now. The next are the Aztecs, and the Aztecs lived in modern-day Mexico City. At the time, it's called Tenochtitlan. And Tenochtitlan was basically an island in the middle of a lake. It was cool, like this big lake and an island in the middle, and this beautiful city was built on it. And so Mexico City is actually built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. but a Spanish man, which we're going to learn about him more in a second, Hernando Cortez, led the conquering of basically the city. Montezuma was the ruler, and the Aztecs were the people. And so he conquered Montezuma and his Aztec people. There's actually a running joke today in Mexico. If you go and drink the water and you're not used to it, you'll get sick. You'll get bad diarrhea. And so it's called Montezuma's Revenge, because the joke is that when non-natives are going to Mexico and they drink the water and get sick, it's Montezuma's way of getting revenge on people for what happened to him and his people. But again, yeah, Hernando Cortez attacked Montezuma, and the Aztecs defeated them back during this time. And then the last one I'm going to talk about are the Incas. The Incas lived in modern Peru. Okay, so we're talking about the west coast of South America. Machu Picchu, beautiful civilization. We talked about this before, but the Incas were the ones who built Machu Picchu. And they were tightly organized communities, and they had a pretty elaborate religious system. I wish we could spend some more time on. Oh, turn that off, sorry. And one thing interesting about the Incas is they were totally, and we'll talk about it in a second, but like one of the conquistadors totally gave them a raw deal. And on that note, let's talk about what a conquistador is and some of the main ones. Conquistador is a Spanish word for conqueror. So again, whereas Portugal had focused on their economic empire, Spain came and with force wanted to subdue people groups and actually build a full-on empire in the New World. So what happened was they were able to subdue entire Indian populations with guns and horses. I mean, it's amazing the kind of power the Spanish had. I've mentioned you guys the book Guns, Germs, and Steel. It does a good job of showing how Europe was able to conquer things so easily. They brought all sorts of diseases with them that killed off a lot of the natives. They brought steel, they brought guns. They had an advantage with firepower and immunity, and that caused the Spanish to have pretty little difficulty conquering large groups of Indians. Hernando Cortez is, of course, the famous one. He focused on conquering Mexico, and he conquered Tenochtitlan, conquered the Aztecs. Kind of associate Cortez with conquering Montezuma and the Aztecs. And if you've ever seen The Road to El Dorado, then Cortez is in that movie. I'll show you a clip of that in a second. The other guy I want to talk about for now is Francisco Pizarro. And he's been called the cruelest conquistador. And then you had the Atahualpa incident with the Incas, and this is what I was referencing a little bit earlier. What happened was Pizarro conquered the leader of the Incas, and he said, if you can fill up an entire room with gold, then I'll give you your leader back unharmed. Well, the Incas went out and found a bunch of gold, filled up the room, and said, okay, give us our leader back. Pizarro killed the leader and killed a bunch of them anyway and took the gold. So he was just not a pleasant guy and not a very good Christian to do something like that. But he and his men did successfully conquer the Incas, and they did it pretty easily, especially with the aiding of diseases on their side. Another two worth noting, Hernando de Soto heard that gold might be up north of Mexico, so he explored the southeast United States and he discovered the Mississippi River. And then you have Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, and he explored the southwestern United States and discovered the Grand Canyon. So again, these are all Spanish explorers that are just starting to head up into the modern day United States and discovering key landmark features. The Spanish eventually would give up and leave North America because they didn't find the gold that they were looking for. Again, gold is a huge reason for the Spanish exploration. As we're going to explore later, the Spanish, when they came to the New World, they mainly were sending warriors, just men to go up and find gold, and they were forcing the natives into slavery to grow them food. But the British handled things a lot differently. The British sent families and built civilization and villages and wanted to actually live in the New World. And that's what's going to give ultimately the advantage to the English later on. But the Spanish, they're just sending men over to fight and conquer, look for gold, and get rich. So it's a very big difference. And here's a little clip. I'm just going to play this real quick. This is from The Road to El Dorado, and if you've seen it before, here's Cortez. And now that you heard the story, again, Cortez is a warrior from Spain who conquered the Aztecs in Mexico. Here's a little bit of a clip, so check it out, of Cortez.
Today, we sail to conquer the New World. For Spain, for glory, for gold. ¡Viva Cortez! My crew was as carefully chosen as the disciples of Christ. tolerate stowaways. You will be flogged. And when we put into Cuba to resupply, God willing, you will be flogged some more. And then enslaved on the sugar plantations for the rest of your miserable lives. To the brink.
Right. Cuba.
That's a funny little clip. But you've probably seen The Road to El Dorado, and so there's Cortez from the movie, and now you know a little bit more about him. Okay, the last slide, and then we'll talk about the week. This is called by some historians the Columbian Exchange. And the idea here is that when Europeans came, they brought things with them, good and bad, and they took things back to Europe, good and bad. Let me explain. So diseases. The Europeans brought smallpox, diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, yellow fever, and other diseases to the Americas from Europe. And then they brought back with them syphilis from the New World to Europe. So you can see an exchanging of germs happening there, which is very interesting. If you're into biology, that's something you may want to look more into. And of course, animals and plants. That to the New World, the Europeans brought cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, chickens. You could also have horses. You could even add cats to the list, because cats were, to my understanding, they were completely foreign to the Americas. But the Europeans would bring cats on their ships because they would kill off the mice. And that was critical because you needed to keep your ships free of those disease-ridden mice and rats so you could protect your food. So cats were usually kept on ships to do that. Now, on top of that, Europe, the Europeans brought back with them corn called maize. And sorry, my brother-in-law is texting. But maize, corn, and potatoes and sweet potatoes were also brought back from the New World to Europe. So cool stuff. A little bit about the Columbian Exchange. Okay, thank you guys. This is a long lecture, but we're covering half this chapter and it's massive. So here's what you're gonna do this week. You already watched the lecture, so kudos to you. Discussion, just go ahead and participate in the discussion. Leave an initial post and 2 replies to your classmates. We are doing that this week. Watch CNN 10 and leave a comment. And then I have a primary source. It's a little bit about Columbus's journey, so just go ahead and complete that. Everything's due by Friday, 3 p.m. Let me know if you have questions. I love you guys. Have a good rest of the day.